Hello, my good students. Today we're going to be practicing rendering and drawing a sphere in Procreate. So first things first, we want to create our file and just going over some etiquette, especially if you're borrowing our studio iPads. So we want to use 8.5 by 11 paper size sRGB file type. And then I also want to go back and name this my name. So I'll do the same format that we asked you guys to do in class. So our first and last name, and then our grade. I don't have a grade, so I'll just put a 1, but put your grade. And then also the day you come to class. So I'm gonna put Tuesday. And yeah, make sure you guys always do that on your files, especially if you're using our studio iPads. So going into the file, I'm gonna pull up my reference. Hopefully you guys can import this reference as well. We can send it to you before you start working on that. So if you need that, maybe just ask a teacher to send it to you right now. And then we're just gonna go ahead and jump in. So the way we're gonna practice today for this specific study is we're gonna use the airbrushes. So like going down to the airbrushes, we're going to use mostly these medium to like hard airbrush tools. And in addition to these tools, kind of depending on what kind of brushes you have, you might not have a completely hard brush. So if I test out this hard airbrush, you can see I can get some variation of how dark it is just with how hard I am pressing. So these lighter ones here are from pressing lighter, the darker ones are pressing harder. And I just want to have a brush that has really no variation in it to start off. So I have my preset brush here that I made, but if you don't have a hard round brush on yours that has no edges, and by that I mean, see how this one doesn't have as much variation. There's sometimes like a little bit on the edges there, but we want it to be pretty solid. In order to create that brush, we can go up to this little plus sign in the brush library, and it's just gonna go to this brush studio here and give you this little automatic one, and you just wanna turn the spacing all the way off. So set it to none and everything to none, and then that will give you the desired effect that we're looking for with no like really visible fall off on the ends there. So we're gonna start off, and you can rename it if you want. So we can go back here and then go to about this brush and then rename it to hard round. And then now we have 2 hard round brushes. So we're mostly going to be using this hard round brush that we created ourselves, and then the soft, medium, and hard air brushes. We're not going to use any of these blending brushes, only these ones up here. I think the preset is usually that the hard air brushes or the air brushes are below the blending brushes, but I just went ahead and moved them up for it to be easier for me. So if you guys want to do that, you can too, but maybe do it later because it takes a little bit of time. So we're gonna go ahead and start with the background of our sphere. So we wanna start out with like a pretty dark value, probably even go a little bit darker than that, maybe around here. We don't have to match all of the values 1-to-1 to our photo reference, but we wanna get it pretty close. So I'm starting out with a pretty dark for the background. I'm gonna go ahead and name that. So we want to be organized. And then I'm gonna do another layer for our sphere. So this is gonna be like the main sphere using a pretty, I would say, mid-tone value to start. Nothing too dark, nothing too light. I wanna just kind of start it to be right in the middle there, because our sphere here is like kind of mid-tony. And then now I wanna make sure I'm using my hard round brush. And I'm going to create a circle. And then once that's created, I'm going to tap where it says ellipse, and then I'm going to tap circle, and it's going to make a perfect circle for me. So again, I'll just go through it one more time. So we're using the hard brush that we created, and then we're holding down and creating a circle. That one has a little gap, so I want to create one that's more full, and then we'll tap on this ellipse icon and it's going to allow me to edit it, and then I'm going to click circle. and then that's going to give me a perfect circle for my sphere. And then I'm going to go ahead and drop that main value in. And now once I have this main shape, I can move it around. Maybe if I want it to be a bit more off center, I can move it around. Again, I can adjust the shape and size. I don't really want to do that because I already have a perfect circle. But if I wanted to make it bigger or smaller and keep that perfect shape, I could click on the uniform and then stretch it or contract it as I need. Next, I'm going to create my plane here. So there's this little kind of gray plane. I would say it's slightly darker than the sphere, so I'm going to go ahead and try that out. And I'm going to use the selection tool to create it in the freehand mode. So I'm just going to kind of grab these big areas. There's some little spaces in the reference. So like, for instance, like these corners in the reference are empty, but I'm just going to keep it enclosed just to be simple. I kind of made this side a little bit wonky, so I'm just going to fix it real quick. There, we want to make sure our brush and our eraser are the hard round brush right now. So I'm just going to go back and edit that, and then just kind of edit the shape a little bit to somewhat match the photo reference, but it doesn't need to be perfect. So we have our three main layers now. We have our sphere, we have our ground plane, which I will name as well. And then we have our background layer. So starting off with just these three layers, and they're all one flat value. And then the next thing we're going to do after blocking in these main values is we're going to start laying in some of the shadow shapes to show the form of the objects using, again, the hard brush and the lasso tool. So I'm going to go on top of the main sphere, and I want to put in this form shadow. So the form shadow is this shape that's like along the side there. And I'm going to use a clipping mask onto the main sphere, so that way I never have to mess with the edge as long as I'm working on it until I want to. So you always want to give treatment to edges when you get into soft and hard edges. But with digital, we can kind of start off with this very clean circular shape and then use a clipping mask, and that will allow us to just focus on getting the values correct. So I'm going to tap on this layer 4, do the clipping mask, and I'm going to rename this to be my, maybe let's do form shadow for the sphere. I'm going to go to my selection tool in the freehand mode again, and I'm going to select that crescent shape that is along the bottom kind of left edge and the bottom of the sphere. And I'm just gonna add in that shadow shape. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you want to go in and edit it a little bit, you can. I think the background needs to be a little bit darker looking at it, so I'm going to go in on that background layer. I'm going to click this little magic wand tool. It's the adjustments panel. I'm going to head to the hue, saturation, and brightness option, and I'm going to darken it. Make sure as you're working that you're always using this just grayscale. Even if it's slightly off grayscale, it's going to add a little color into it, and we really just want to stay in grayscale this entire time. So now I have the form shadow for my sphere. The next thing I want to add to my form shadow is the cast shadow. So I'm going to go underneath the main sphere and in between the plane. And I'm going to rename that to be cast shadow. To create the cast shadow, I'm going to go to our selection tool again and use the ellipse tool, and try to create one that matches our reference as best as possible. Once that's created, I can go ahead into this move tool and kind of shift it around to match the photo. I can also kind of edit it a little bit in this freeform mode. We don't want uniform for this part. I want it to be freeform, so I can kind of mash the shape to how I want it to be and just try to get in as close as possible, but again, doesn't have to be 100% accurate. Okay, so now we have our sphere, the plane, the background, the form shadow around the sphere, and then also the cast shadow on the sphere as well. These are all separate layers, and we're just setting up the main values. Another thing we're gonna add is the highlight on the sphere. So I'm gonna go in and I'm just gonna kind of roughly place it. I'm not gonna use a value 1 yet. I'm just gonna set it to be like a more, like maybe value 2 or so. And again, we're still using the hard round brush. So at this stage, we just have our little highlight, our form shadow, our cast shadow. The next stage in this is we're gonna actually start doing a little bit of blending. So how do we get the transition from this light side of the sphere? The light is coming and hitting the sphere, and this is our highlight. And this is overall like our whole light shape. And then we have our form shadow and our cast shadow. And now we want to blend out those really hard edges that we created and create a little bit more softness and transition. So going into the form shadow on the main sphere using that clipping mask, I'm going to start using something other than maybe the hard round, or I actually might still use hard round, and I'm gonna put in the core shadow. So I'm kind of using like a pretty dark color here, but only slightly darker than the overall form shadow. And I'm gonna build that up and just go a little bit darker here. And it doesn't have to be 100% like super clean and perfect right now. I'm just trying to kind of like lay it in. Still with this hard round brush. Another area I might go on top of now is for the cast shadow. I might put in a little bit of a pit shadow. So just trying to make it a lot darker. That. And I'm just gonna go a little bit darker right underneath the sphere where it's actually sitting. Whoop. Okay, so now we're at this stage, which I'll point out, we've added our core shadow and then also our pit shadow. So now we would have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 values because I added a little midtone there. But it's still not really convincing, obviously. So now I'm gonna go into using the airbrush tool. So I'm going down to airbrushing, and I'm gonna start with the hard airbrush tool. When you use these airbrush tools, I think typically it's good to kind of start more big, kind of like how when we're painting in real life, we wanna sort of start with our big brushes. And then I'm gonna start to paint in on the form shadow, kind of like some of these transitions from where it's really dark going into the core shadow and into this underbelly of the sphere here, which is catching the reflected light from the plane. I can kind of go on top of this maybe a little bit with just my big brush and maybe add like a little bit of darker value. So this next step as I'm working on this form shadow layer is I'm gonna actually start doing some reduction to the layer to create more of a soft transition. So right now you can see like this area here on the belly, it's not a very smooth blend, you know. I can start to see generally the direction it should be going, but these values aren't blending super smoothly. So I want to create more of a smooth blend, and I can either keep picking out different midtone values to go in between them, and that would kind of work like real painting in a sense, is you kind of have to like, you know, pick the values and put them in the right spot. And I can also use my eraser to help create a little bit of a transition as well. So I'm going to use the hard airbrush. Maybe I might use more soft airbrush, I think, soft brush. So I'm going to use a soft brush, and it's pretty big, so I'm going to start going over on top of the form shadow to kind of soften like a little bit of like the edge that I put down. Maybe not that much, but still just kind of softening it. So I like to kind of work with these two in tandem of like lightening and darkening. It's kind of similar almost to like when you are doing, say, like a pencil drawing of a sphere or a charcoal drawing of a sphere, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna start blending out using like a paper towel. Laying in our initial values is a lot faster because we're working digitally and you don't need to like fill everything in just on your hand alone. You can use these big brushes and it goes a lot more quickly, but I'm just trying to get that edge that I put down to have like a little bit more transition. I might start going into the highlight area now. Maybe I might do another layer for just the general light value, like just our light shape. And I'm going to use a clipping mask for that as well. And I'm going to use a softer brush for my value that's lighter, because I feel like that's really like subtle. So just kind of big brush and laying it down. And then going back and reducing some of what I put down. So I'm working with these layers, and I'm kind of adding with the brush and using the eraser to take things back a little bit. I'm making sure I'm on the right layer because I was on the wrong one. Going in and starting to really trying to push this core shadow. So adding that in. I can kind of erase a little bit of this reflected light out, trying to just create like a bit more of a soft light. I'm jumping between values when I feel like I need them, and then also switching between the different hardnesses of airbrushes. You definitely don't always want to be working with the soft brush. I feel like the soft brush is like more for kind of blending out the edge once you lay in the kind of bigger value. Okay, so we have, I think, a good start here. It's definitely starting to look like closer to our reference, but we can continue on to help it look more rendered. So I'm just kind of like touching up that core shadow and making sure it feels round. I think it's totally okay. Like sometimes you guys can see as I'm like working on it, I'm just kind of laying down stuff that looks like that, and I think that is fine. I'm gonna go maybe now into my highlight and start to soften that a little bit. So I want to erase it out a little, maybe using my soft brush instead though. I'm gonna kind of like erase the edge a little bit and use medium airbrush and just go even smaller on that spot I had, and then using that hard airbrush and really just kind of trying to push right in the center there. Really bright little highlight. I still feel like the overall top light shape is not bright enough, so I'm going to go back onto our light value shape and fill that in a little bit more with our soft brush. Just kind of lightly tapping and pressing to create a little bit more brightness on the top there. Again, this is kind of on a separate layer, so it's covering the form shadow a little bit when I get like a little too far in, so I can go back in and erase that a little bit. I think that's starting to work pretty well. I might erase just a little bit out of that light shape again there. And then now I want to work more on creating more transition kind of from this core shadow in the form shadow, like from here to here. This transition from here to here is not very solid yet, so I want to work on that a little bit. So going back into my form shadow layer, I might use this soft brush now to kind of like add like a little bit more like soft dark from like the belly of the sphere up into that top area. And what working on these separate layers does is that like I can work on this form shadow layer and it's not affecting the light shape that I've added in. So I can just have it be a little bit easier to make edits. This type of working for digital art using layers is like people refer to it as non-destructive. So me adding in this darker dark with my hard brush on the form shadow layer, it's not going to affect the light value that I put in. Trying to get really pretty dark on this like upper edge and turn here. Again, using a little bit of like a textured line, just subtly. I might try to make this a little bit more consistent for how the light is hitting that underneath there. It's kind of like a back and forth of sometimes filling in and taking out to get it to look how you want it. So I'm going back in with this like medium value and brushing it in a little bit. Next, I want to give some attention to the background. So the background's always going to support our main object, which is the sphere, and we want that to look pretty solid as well. So I'm going into where the pitch shadow is, and I'm going to start to darken the cast shadow. I want to make sure that the pitch shadow is clipping to my cast shadow, so I can just put in a big value. My opacity was really down low on my brush. And I'm just gonna make the cast shadow get a little bit lighter as it's fading to the left side. So I want, as the cast shadow goes out and to the left, I want that to lighten. And then the darkest part is gonna be right here. Next, I'm going to start adding a little bit of lighting to the background as well. So in this photo reference that we're using, there's not really much lighting happening in the background or really on the plane, but but I just want to add it in. So I want to create a transition from light to dark on the back plane, as well as on the ground plane. I want to create this same lighting on the sphere on the other parts of the drawing. So I'm going to go into my background layer, I'm going to add another layer on top of that, and I'm going to add a shadow. I'm going to select the color I have, the value I have, it's pretty dark already. I'm going to go a little bit darker, use a big soft brush. I'm just going to lay in a really dark here, trying to create a little bit of a lost edge between the background and the back edge of the sphere there. And then I want to do the same thing for the plane. So I'm going to add a shadow for the plane, and I want to use a clipping mask for that. So grabbing my value, going a bit darker, and then big soft brush, laying in that overall value. I can also go in and add a light shape potentially, especially on the plane. I feel like that might be getting some light. And so now I'm going to take that same value, bump it up, and then do a little bit of a clipping mask there. And create this kind of illusion of like, okay, light's also sort of like hitting on the plane in the background. I could even do a little bit on the background layer. So doing another layer and just adding in, oops, that's too much. Maybe a little bit darker. A little bit of light on this side to create a bit more of like a dramatic lit effect. So I think the next thing we're going to go into is maybe start creating some soft edges. You can see like these edges on my sphere are pretty harsh, and I feel like we need to have some lost edges to create more of a realistic look. So the first edges I'm going to address, I think, are on the sphere itself. So I'm going to go back to my area that I have the main sphere, and on top of these clipping masks of like the form shadow and the light value and the highlight, I think I'm going to do one more layer for the dark value. And I'm going to go on top of this edge here, and I'm going to start to just use a dark value and sort of lose the edge there. I'm going to erase it out a little bit. Going back to my, I think, hard airbrush. Just creating like a soft lost edge. And this is breaking off of our clipping mask, so it's kind of like also making the sphere a little bit more like imperfect almost, which I think is good. You want it to look like a drawing. It's nice to have a little bit of that hand-drawn look. Another spot I'm going to work in, so I'm going to say this will be my lost edge for the sphere. And I want to work that in also on like this bottom part here, where the sphere is touching the pit shadow. So I'm going to use a big brush. Maybe I might go with this medium airbrush, we'll see. And I want to just soften that. And then, you know, that doesn't look great. I need to go in and edit it with the eraser tool now. So I want the darkest part to definitely be where it's like kind of touching. So like that can be a little bit lighter. And that's going to be softer there. So like if I turn off these lost edge areas, you can see it's like a lot more clear, especially like on that bottom part where that's happening. Not, I think, as apparent in this back area, but still, I think, helping. And I also want to start creating a little bit of kind of like almost like not such a harsh edge too on like this highlight area. So I might do, for another one, I might do another lost edge, but like a light shape. And then just to keep it simple, I'm going to combine my highlight with my light value. Whoop. Merge down. Okay, so I'm going to get a light value on my last edge for the light shape. And I'm gonna do, I think, big soft brush. I like using the soft brush for like when I need a really big brush. So I'm kind of like creating this edge. And just making it feel a little bit more bright on the top. Almost making it feel maybe like a little bit like, not that it's like glowing, but just like lights hitting it really, really hard. And then I can also use my medium airbrush and kind of disrupt the edge a little bit too, I think. So just kind of going over and disrupting that edge a little bit. Because I think sometimes just using the lasso tool or like the preset tools make the objects feel a little bit stiff if you're going for like a more realistic look, and sometimes we don't want that. So we're looking at our soft edges. If I check the way it looks without those, I think it definitely adds another level of like kind of finish looking to it. I want to go now to my cast shadow and adjust that edge as well. And again, I don't want this to be a clipping mask because I want to. So I'm going to do cast shadow, lost edge. For some of you, I know that this may be like a lot of layers, and it is a lot of layers. Eventually, like we might get into like if you feel comfortable like wanting to combine, like if you feel like your drawing is really solid and is not going to need like a whole lot of like adjustments, that would be totally fine to do. But we want to use the digital tools to the best of our, like, we want to utilize them so that it's actually like making sense for us to be doing digital. Not that it doesn't make sense if you're not using layers, but I think it really helps so that way, like if, especially when you're learning, someone has a note and say Miss Mary tells me like, oh, Isabel, your cast shadow is like looking kind of weird, or like the edge between the cast shadow and the sphere is looking weird. And now I can go to that edge that I created and I can adjust that by like maybe either erasing if I need to, if it's too harsh, or adding on to it. And it's not destroying my other layers. So again, that's called using layers in a way that's like non-destructive. So I went ahead and kind of softened a little bit of the edge of the cast shadow. I might add a little bit of more light hitting on this part of like the plane here. And then I think I'm going to go back to my form shadow, like the main form shadow on the sphere, and edit that because I want it to be a little bit stronger. So this whole time, again, I've just been mostly using like between the medium airbrush, the hard airbrush, and then the soft airbrush for just creating a little bit more like subtle shifts on top. And it's best to kind of start out with a hard airbrush as always, and you know, after you get everything in, you can go back and start noodling with like the softer brushes. Just looking at it with and without, kind of seeing what I can do to it. Sometimes like at the end, because we're kind of, I think nearing the end of this video, like we can keep working on this sphere on our own, but hopefully you guys can see like how I'm handling the different brushes and how to kind of like erase and add in order to create the transitions. Like right now I feel like this is a little bit too much, so I'm gonna soften it. This I'm having to like go in for the transition and really just grab value and kind of block it in rather than only like erasing, because I want to get like a little bit more softness. Definitely want, I think, this bottom right corner to feel less dark overall than that top right corner that's like really far, but I still want a little bit of darkness down there. Okay, so I feel like that's doing okay. I feel like this, I want to still feel a bit more rounded. I might cut into that a little bit. And then push my core shadow again, because I think it was getting a little bit lost. And then I probably will go back to my highlight too, and then try to boost that as well. Starting with the hard, using a little bit of the medium and the soft to kind of brush over that. Might add like a little bit of, not like on the edge, but just like a little bit brighter on the top part there. So you can see I'm starting to feel like a little bit more of the transition. I feel like my form shadow is getting a bit misshapen, so I'll probably go and edit that in mine. That's the nice thing, is like I can go and like erase that like out a little bit. And then I can go to the lost edge and like edit that a little bit, and then it's not lost. Mine was getting like a little bit too tall, the angle. Might go in and... Okay, so I just kind of like redid mine a little bit because I didn't really like how the shape was looking. Still feel like this area on this edge can be just a little bit more round feeling. I always like to make sure my form shadow is feeling very like following the curve of the sphere. Right now I feel like mine's a little bit wobbly. So the same principles though, like that I'm using with these brushes, like I feel like they're a little bit more harsh than some of the textured brushes. Like sometimes it's a little easier to get like a really specific blender look with like a textured brush and using like a different brush pack. But if you can get like a pretty nice blend just with using these like harder airbrush tools, it's good practice to kind of make sure that your rendering skills are pretty sharp. Again, I might go back on this lost edge area and kind of like disrupt that a little bit. And then also just kind of try to push that a little bit darker. I personally never use the blur tool. You can use it. It's just sometimes the way it works, I feel like the way it smears the values, like especially if you do it like a lot, it kind of just like makes everything feel like just soft again. And you don't always want that. But if you want to go over it for it to just get rid of like a little spot of like texture, I think that's fine. But we try to encourage you guys to learn how to kind of like blend things out on your own for the most part. It's just a good practice to kind of like use your own hand and like spot the values that you need in order to create the transitions that you need, rather than only relying on like this pre-done like tool that's doing it for you. So hopefully that helped you guys. I could go back in and like also start subtly, I think, disrupting. Like I could do the same layers for like lost edges on bigger parts of the drawing there. So like wanting this to feel like more lost in the background for that edge, and using just like that big brush to like lay it in and kind of start to create like a more subtle transition. I think it's really good like to use like really big brush for like those softer gradients that you want to have, because if you use like a smaller brush, it's just gonna take you longer. So like that's kind of without it, and that's with it. Hopefully you guys can kind of see that. We could also do something similar on, you know, this edge if we wanted to. I think it's fine because it's like getting a lot more light. So we can just leave that. But yeah, we have quite a few layers, but I think they're all pretty clear. And then, you know, they're all editable still. If this is like, oh, and like that doesn't work, I can go back in and erase that out. I can go in and just working on my form shadow because that's separate. You know, the lost edges are separate. All of that can be edited apart from each other. And I think that is just how I like to work and how it helps, I think, the most, as far as just making sure you're able to make adjustments easily without having to like completely like repaint always. Because in real life, when we are working, whenever we make a mark, it's affecting the whole drawing or painting, and we can't really like take it back. But for digital, like, we can. Anyways, that's pretty much it. I know I keep saying that, but I think that really is it. And hopefully that helps you guys understand how to approach rendering a little bit better.